My dad was sitting in the living room, completely locked in. He was listening to two women play Danny Boy on the piano. He was impressed and commented on their talent. He was even humming along like it was the most ordinary Sunday afternoon you could imagine. Except there were no women at the piano. No one was there. It was just my mom, sitting nearby, watching the man she'd been married to for more than 50 years drift into a world she couldn't access. For a long time, my mom called it memory problems. And honestly, that's how the system treated it too. Like it was just forgetfulness, like it was just aging. But vivid, well-formed visual hallucinations aren't a quirky detail. They are a huge clue. And very often, they're pointing straight at Lewy body dementia. I'm Kristen Beasley. I'm a certified functional medicine, nutrition, and brain health coach. And this is the Healthy Life Approach podcast. Today is part 2 of my dementia series, and it's personal because this one is my father's story. I'm going to be direct with you. What I'm about to describe is something families can live with for years. It's also something that gets missed way too often. And when it's missed, the consequences can be dangerous. One quick heads up before we go further. This episode includes psychiatric hospitalization, end-of-life experiences, and the loss of both of my parents. If that's too close for you today, please take care of yourself. You can always come back when you're ready. Also, this is educational. I am not a medical doctor. None of this is medical advice. If you are worried about someone, please seek a full cognitive evaluation from qualified professionals. The moment I knew something was truly wrong didn't happen in a hospital. It happened because my refrigerator broke. My refrigerator was leaking. My wood floors were starting to buckle. So I did what I always did. I called my dad. He called me back and he sounded like himself, clear, confident, problem solver mode. He told me exactly what to do. Then he called again and again and again. A dozen calls, each one basically identical, like the previous conversation had been wiped clean. That's when my stomach dropped. This wasn't keys on the counter forgetfulness. This was different. I called my mom and I told her he needed to be evaluated. She tried to soothe me. She said he was stressed, but to her credit, she made the appointment with a neurologist. And that's what I think of as the beginning of the long reveal. Here's something that can be hard to wrap your mind around until you've lived with it. With neurodegenerative diseases, the biology can start years before anyone gives it a name. In Lewy body dementia, the underlying process involves abnormal alpha-synuclein, and this process may be active for years, sometimes even a decade or more before a formal diagnosis. One example comes from research on REM sleep behavior disorder, where people physically act out their dreams. Studies show there can be a long gap between those sleep symptoms and eventual neurodegenerative diagnosis. One large multi-center study published in the journal Brain found that more than 70% of people with isolated REM sleep behavior disorder eventually developed something like Lewy body dementia or Parkinson's. So when families say it came out of nowhere, I get it. It does feel sudden. But biologically, it often wasn't sudden at all, which leads to the question I want you to sit with. Is there a persistent hunch you've had about someone you love that you've been brushing off? Because early signs matter. Over the next several years, the easiest to spot symptom in my dad was repetition. Conversations looped, stories repeated, the same questions came back around, and my mom kept using that phrase, memory problems. But there were other things happening that didn't fit a simple memory of memory. She'd tell us almost like she didn't know what else to do with it, that dad would jump out of bed in the middle of the night and start shouting his military ID and his social security number, standing at attention like he'd been dropped back into active service. It wasn't once. It was a pattern. Now we know that's classic REM sleep behavior disorder, and it can show up years before a more obvious cognitive decline. And then that living room scene wasn't a one-off either. The hallucinations became a regular part of life, detailed, vivid, real to him, people in the room, scenes that weren't there. Estimates vary, but it's often said that a majority of people with Lewy body dementia experience visual hallucinations. At the time, we didn't understand what we were looking at. We didn't have a framework. We just had confusion and a growing sense that something was sliding out of place. So let's talk about that framework because it can change everything. The most widely used clinical approach for diagnosing Lewy body dementia is based on the McKeith consensus criteria. You don't need to be a neurologist to understand the basics. And honestly, if you're supporting someone, knowing this checklist can help you ask better questions and push for the right evaluation. There are 4 clinical core features. If a person has at least 2, it supports a probable diagnosis, as clinicians call it. First is fluctuating cognition. This is when someone can look surprisingly sharp for a moment. They're witty, focused, and present. And then later, it's gone. Those swings can create a lot of false hope. Families think, see, they're fine, but the pattern itself is information. Second is recurrent visual hallucinations, usually well-formed and detailed, not vague shadows. Not, I thought I saw something, more like specific people, animals, or scene. Third is REM sleep behavior disorder, where the person acts out dreams physically. And fourth is spontaneous Parkinsonism, which can present as slower movement, stiffness, changes in gait, reduced facial expression, reduced blinking, and changes in voice or speech. There are also other features that matter. One of the biggest is severe sensitivity to antipsychotic medications. And I want to linger there because in Lewy body dementia, medication sensitivity can be life or death. Before we go deeper into that, I want you to understand who my dad was. My father was brilliant. He was a NASA engineer working on Apollo, the Space Shuttle, and the X-33. He was a part of Werner von Braun's team, thinking about how humans might get to Mars long before a rover ever touched the surface. He traveled to Russia to support work connected to the International Space Station. On that trip, he used tap water to brush his teeth and came home with giardia. He got extremely sick. I'm not telling you that because I'm claiming one caused the other. I can't prove that. But when you start learning about inflammation, infections, the microbiome, and the gut-brain connection, it's hard not to wonder if those big bodily hits matter more than we've historically acknowledged. Later, in memory care, my dad would hold what we called NASA meetings. He talked like the projects were active, like deadlines were real, like decisions had to be made right now. Part of me wondered if his brain was trying to find a place where he still felt confident and needed. When the present stopped making sense, it sent him back to the place where he'd been most himself. If you're listening and you're thinking, this is lining up with someone in my life, stay with me. Because the diagnosis doesn't just give you a label. In Lewy body dementia, the diagnosis affects safety. Let's talk about modifiable risk and what the research says we can influence. The National Institute on Aging points out that in most cases, we don't know the exact causes of Lewy body dementia, but a known cause doesn't mean nothing can be done. The 2024 Lancet Commission outlined 14 modifiable risk factors that together account for a large portion of dementia cases worldwide. Things like hearing loss, high blood pressure, smoking, obesity, physical inactivity, diabetes, excessive alcohol use, traumatic brain injury, air pollution, depression, social isolation, untreated vision loss, and elevated LDL cholesterol. And the FINGER trial, a large randomized controlled trial from Finland, showed something helpful. When people combined exercise, diet improvements, cognitive training, and vascular risk management, they saw measurable cognitive benefits over 2 years. We also have to acknowledge that genetics can play a meaningful role. Risk genes like ApoE, GBA, and SNCA show up in the research. Family history matters, and it's worth discussing with a clinician. And then there's the gut-brain axis, which is becoming a real frontier in this. Some research suggests alpha-synuclein pathology may begin outside the brain, potentially in the gut, and travel via the vagus nerve. So we may be looking at a story that involves the brain, yes, but also inflammation, metabolism, sleep, and the whole body environment. Now, back to medication sensitivity, because this is one of the places where families get blindsided. The McKeith criteria lists severe sensitivity to antipsychotic medications as an important diagnostic clue. And studies suggest a large percentage of people with Lewy body dementia have serious neuroleptic sensitivity. That can mean extreme worsening of confusion, increased rigidity, heavy sedation, and in some cases, fatal reactions. Some older first-generation antipsychotics are widely recognized as especially dangerous for Lewy body patients. And yet, in our family's experience, in emergency situations, my dad was given exactly the kinds of medications Lewy body organizations warn against. Not once, more than once. So here's a practical step you can take, and I'm saying this as plainly as I can. Ask the neurologist to document medication sensitivities in writing. Carry printed information from trusted organizations, such as the Lewy Body Dementia Association. Make an easy medication alert card, the kind of thing you can hand an ER nurse in 5 seconds. Diagnosis, key warnings, allergies, emergency contacts, and if you ever have to call 911, say it clearly. Lewy body dementia, medication sensitivity, because in an emergency, you don't get extra time to explain. You get seconds, and those seconds matter. Lewy body dementia has a particular kind of cruelty built into it. The fluctuations. My dad could suddenly be there, really there, wise, funny, clear. He'd look at my mom like he'd recognized her completely. He'd say something that sounded exactly like the man she married. And then minutes later, the fog would roll back in. He'd ask who she was. He'd say she was an imposter. He'd panic because he couldn't find his Judy. That emotional whiplash is hard to describe unless you've lived it. It hands you hope and then snatches it back again and again. And there's another layer. Sometimes agitation and aggression show up in Lewy body dementia. When hallucinations are a part of the picture, you can see how fast a situation could become an emergency. What I wish we had understood earlier is this: the person isn't choosing to be difficult. They may truly believe the threat is real. So let's talk about de-escalation, because this is a practical caregiver survival. One of the biggest lessons is to avoid arguing with what they see. When my dad heard the piano music, my mom's instinct was to correct him, to say, no, there's no one there. That makes sense. We want them anchored to reality, but often correction increases fear. It can escalate. Even caregiver guidance from the National Institute on Aging recommends not trying to force the person to admit the hallucination isn't real. A gentler strategy is to join the emotion without validating the danger. If they say they hear music, you can say, that sounds beautiful, and then redirect to something soothing. The goal isn't to win a fact check. The goal is to create emotional safety. After my mother died, Dad would ask, where's Judy? And for a while, I answered with something that soothed him. I'd say she was at the beauty shop because every Friday she was. That simple story lowered his anxiety. Later, when hospice told me he was dying, that was a different moment. I told him the truth then. I told him she had gone ahead, and if he was ready, she'd be there waiting. Because at the end, it wasn't about redirecting anymore. It was about letting go. There are other practical patterns families can look for. Approach from the front. Speak slowly. Don't rush. Track their triggers. In our experience, infections like UTIs, loud environments, hurried care, and broken sleep could all make things worse. And when a facility took the time to learn my dad, they could sometimes interrupt agitation before it turned into a crisis. Redirecting him to familiar topics like NASA or Auburn football could be enough to pull him back. Still, we had crisis after crisis. Over about 2 years in memory care, my dad was sent to geriatric psychiatric unit 4 times, and the emergency room for us became less like a place of healing and more like a place of harm. Part of that is systemic. Dementia patients tend to have longer ER stays and higher risk of medication errors, and for Lewy body patients, the medication sensitivity issue raises the stakes even higher. Families assume memory care is consistently regulated and trained. The reality is uneven. Training requirements vary, policies vary. So if you're ever in the position of choosing memory care, I want to offer a few questions that are uncomfortable but necessary. What dementia-specific training does the staff receive, and does it include Lewy body dementia? What is the staff-to-resident ratio at night? How do they respond to agitation before medication? Under what circumstances do they send someone out to the ER or discharge them? When we had to move my dad to a facility in Georgia, the difference was immediate. Not just nurses, but the whole culture. Cooks, housekeepers, everyone had dementia training. And that kind of environment changes safety and dignity. If all of this can be building for years, then what should people look for early? I'm not sharing these to create panic. I'm sharing them to create possibility, because earlier action is often better action. Some early red flags that show up in Lewy body and Parkinson's patterns include loss of smell, persistent constipation or gut changes, REM sleep behavior disorder, long-term exposure to environmental toxins like certain chemicals or air pollution, and signs of chronic inflammation or metabolic dysfunction. These aren't diagnostic by themselves, but if you hear them and you think, wait, that sounds familiar, it might be time to document what you're seeing and seek a thorough evaluation. I also want to speak directly to spouse caregivers listening right now. If you feel like you're carrying this alone, you're not. If you're scared to say out loud what's happening at home, you're not the only one. Caregivers need care too. They need protection. They need to be treated like patients because the stress is not harmless. This experience is one of the reasons I built my 3-pillar framework: build your base, know your numbers, and own your outcomes. Not because it's fancy, because it's fundamental. Sleep, movement, nutrition, managing vascular risk, reducing isolation, supporting hearing and vision, addressing depression, lowering inflammation where possible. The same kind of multi-domain approach research like the finger trial supports. When I look back at my dad's story, I can't help but think about how many years we were living in crisis mode instead of taking aim at those fundamentals early. We didn't get the correct diagnosis until about a month before my dad died. There's a guideline clinicians use that can help distinguish Lewy body dementia from Parkinson's disease dementia. If movement symptoms clearly come first and then cognitive decline shows up more than a year later, clinicians often consider Parkinson's disease dementia. If cognitive changes come first or appear within a year of movement symptoms, that points more towards Lewy body dementia. In my dad's case, the cognitive and psychiatric features were front and center first. The hallucinations, the confusion, the repetition, the fluctuation, the Parkinsonian movement changes became clearer later. By the time the diagnosis arrived, our window for meaningful course correction had basically closed. My mom cared for my dad for 7 years. She loved him so fiercely that she moved into memory care with him because she couldn't stand the idea of being apart. About 18 months after they moved in, she was diagnosed with a stage 4 glioblastoma brain tumor. 12 weeks later, she was gone. I cannot say caregiving caused her cancer. That's not something I can claim, but I can say the stress was relentless. And caregivers deserve real medical attention and real support, not just praise for being strong. So why am I telling you this all publicly? Because I can't change what happened to my family. But maybe your story can be different. Maybe someone listening will hear visual hallucinations and realize that it is not something to be brushed aside. Maybe a caregiver will stop arguing about what's real and start choosing what's calming. Maybe a family will walk into the ER with written documentation about medication sensitivities and prevent a catastrophic reaction. If you remember only a few things from today, let them be these. Visual hallucinations are not normal aging. They are a core diagnostic feature that needs serious evaluation. Dementia is not one disease, and the label matters because medication safety can differ dramatically. Act earlier than you think. The best time to protect brain health is before symptoms arise, but the next best time is now. Modifiable risk factors matter. The evidence is real and hopeful, and protect the caregiver. The stress has consequences, and it deserves to be addressed. If someone you love is showing signs of decline, here are a few practical next steps. Trust your instincts and keep pushing for answers. Write down what you're seeing with dates and specific examples, not just more confused, but called me 12 times in 1 hour with the same question. Ask for a comprehensive evaluation, not just a quick memory screen. Ask what type of dementia is suspected and why. Treat visual hallucinations as a clinical red flag and advocate. Sometimes that means bringing printed information and asking for a second opinion. Next week, we're going deep on hearing loss as a modifiable risk factor for dementia. It's personal for me because I wear hearing aids, and it's also one of the strongest data-backed risk factors we have. The Lancet Commission highlighted untreated hearing loss as one of the biggest modifiable contributors, yet so many people still don't know. We'll talk about the science, what to watch for, and practical ways to protect your brain health through your ears. My dad's mind helped build a path to the stars, and then in his final years, that same mind generated meetings that weren't happening, dangers that weren't there, and piano players that nobody else could see. Between the engineer and the patient was a human being who deserved earlier recognition, safer medical care, and dignity. I am sharing his story so that if you are seeing these signs in your family, you might recognize them sooner, ask better questions, and protect the person you love. Take care of your beautiful brain. Disclaimer, I am a health coach, not a licensed medical professional. This podcast is for general educational and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek guidance from your physician or another qualified health provider about your medical concerns. This podcast and show notes may contain affiliate links, and as an Amazon associate, I may earn from qualifying purchases at no additional cost to you.